So any slideshow about Yosemite, kind of needs to start with the epic and amazing icons of the park. And there's not much more prominent than El Capitan as it rises 3,300 feet out of Yosemite Valley. It's just got such a stately nature and is a focal point for so many folks coming into the valley. And over the years, it's never detracted my attention. I've spent more time probably photographing El Capitan than any other feature in Yosemite, mostly because there's so many perspectives and directions to photograph it, as well as all the different seasons and perspectives and ways to capture the beauty of such a massive granite formation. I think one of the most important, or not more, the best ways to really experience kind of the massive scale of El Capitan is actually go down to the meadow below it and lay down on your back and look up. And from that perspective, it gives a whole intense meaning just to how massive a rock face it is. Not to mention, it gives amazing credit and respect for the rock climbers around the world that flock to Yosemite Valley to climb El Capitan. It's just one of the absolute destination spots for climbers. And for any of you who haven't seen a couple of phenomenal documentary movies on climbing in El Capitan or climbing in Yosemite, there's one called The Dawn Wall and another called Free Solo that are just spectacular documentaries about climbing on El Capitan.
Look at that.
Free Solo, I saw it.
This is perhaps my favorite image I've ever taken of El Cap. And it really launched my photography career forward many years ago when I took it. And I'm sure a lot of photographers have a similar story where, I went into Yosemite, it was a super thick snowstorm. It was snowing all day long, thick in the clouds. I was trudging around, really didn't shoot at all. It was just a stormy day. And then shortly before sunset, I decided, well, let's just go for it, hike out to a spot that I've been working on for years, trying to capture images just in case the storm cleared up. And I walked out there, hung out for a while, freezing my butt off. My feet were numb. And then lo and behold, 20 minutes before sunset, the clouds parted a little bit and the sun popped through and just created the most magical illumination on the landscape. And this is when I was shooting film before making the transfer to digital. And I was standing in front of the tripod, literally saying to myself, God, don't screw this up. This is the most phenomenally amazing light I've ever seen. But before shooting digital, you don't really know what you get until a couple of weeks later, I got the slides back and realized it was something, a really, really special moment in time of a snowy snowstorm with El Cap and beautiful light. Yosemite Falls is another one of the obvious amazing icons in Yosemite Valley. And during the spring peak flow, it's really an amazing sight to behold. The intense roar of the sound of the water coming off the cliff faces and the spray everywhere is so incredibly powerful. And the reason for that is literally over 2,000 gallons of water plunge over that precipice every second during peak flow, falling 2,400 feet down to the valley floor along a couple of different cascades. And I'm not sure if you all can see my cursor. I think you probably can, but the waterfall is actually 3 different waterfalls. There's Upper Yosemite Fall, Middle Cascades that you can't see here in the image, and then Lower Yosemite Fall right here. And interestingly, a lot of folks assume this is taken in the fall because of the color in the oak trees here, but actually it was in the spring when the water was at a peak flow. And during the first flush of leaf growth in the spring, the deciduous trees oftentimes put out really colorful, leaves are really colorful before they turn a deeper green. And that's why there's color in the foliage down there in the black oaks. An interesting thing about the Yosemite Falls watershed, actually I'm going to backtrack for a second here real quick before I go to the next one, is that a lot of folks assume that waterfall flows year round, but that's actually not the case. The whole watershed, including the waterfall, is on a south-facing aspect. And the watershed above there has hardly any lakes or any wetlands. And so it doesn't hold much water. And so almost every summer, Yosemite Falls dries up entirely. So there's only a relatively small window of time when it's really flowing heavy. But during that peak spring flow on certain years, the volume of water coming down into the valley outpaces the Merced River's ability to convey the water out of the valley, and it overflows the banks of the Merced River. And it creates these huge, very shallow but broad lakes across oftentimes the entire valley. And this is a really important ecological part of the succession in Yosemite Valley, where this flush of water helps to recharge the groundwater aquifers, as well as depositing minerals and nutrients in the soil that lots of other species depend upon later in their cycle. And on top of all the wonderful ecological implications, that massive amount of water and all of the reflections it creates makes an already pretty phenomenal landscape even more grand. In the spring and early summer, if conditions come together just right in Yosemite, a truly phenomenal and very unique occurrence can happen. And it's called a lunar rainbow or a moonbow. And during these windows of time when the waterfall is at or near its peak flow, and there's a full moon or very close to a full moon, the illumination from the moon from certain directions and angles at certain times in Yosemite Valley reveals an amazing, what you could call a rainbow, but it's not caused by rain, but looks like a rainbow. That's caused by the combination of spray off the rainbow and the moonlight. And this has become a bit of a well-known phenomenon because of the social media craze. And in the last maybe 5 or 6 years has absolutely blown up in notoriety. So now in the couple of spots that people know this is taking place at the right time, there could be hundreds of people, literally hundreds upon hundreds of people all lined up trying to photograph it from the spot. And you know, that's not exactly my type of photography, but I really wanted to experience this. And so one night I went out there, saw where everybody was congregating, kind of, you know, watched that whole, everything that was going on, all the chaos going out there, and then waited until that all dissipated. And then I followed the lunar rainbow as it moved across Yosemite Falls for many hours that night. And finally at about 2 a.m, you know, I found a spot where it was really popping out. There was nobody around. And I had just this really moment of bliss where it was a phenomenal experience that I was having, a really unique phenomenon. And one thing I'd add about this is it's really interesting that the camera actually picks up the colors of the rainbow way more than the naked eye does. So when you're out there looking at it, these actually just look like very pale bands with tiny bits of color. But the camera sensor can pick it up much better than our eyes can. And so the images come out far more appealing and compelling than just seeing it in person. Yeah. The first waterfall that most folks encounter when they come into Yosemite Valley is Bridal Veil Fall. And, you know, in contrast to Yosemite Falls, Bridal Veil's aspect is north facing, and the watershed up above the waterfall has quite a few more significant wetlands and lakes that hold water. And so although the watershed itself is smaller than the Yosemite Falls watershed, oftentimes Bridal Veil will flow year round. And that's kind of what made this a unique image. There's, you know, oftentimes I like juxtapositions of conditions, and a combination of flowing water and a fresh snowfall is such a unique encounter that you know, those are the kinds of things that I try to photograph when I'm out there. And kind of one of the things, as we were talking about briefly in the chat ahead of all of this, you know, Yosemite is magical any time of year, but in the winter under a fresh snowfall, it is just truly spectacular. So there are a lot of really famous icons in Yosemite, obviously, El Cap and Half Dome and all the waterfalls. But I've always felt like there are a lot of really amazing features that don't quite get the notoriety that they should. And so I spent a fair amount of time trying to give them the visibility and the face that they deserve. And this is, these are Cathedral Spires, kind of right across the valley from El Capitan. And interestingly, the Cathedral Spires are actually only there because during the last glaciation, the Tioga glaciation, the river of ice that came and flowed into Yosemite Valley only flowed partway up the valley wall. And so it left the more precarious parts of rock free from the normal erosional processes that the glacier would have had. If the glacier had been farther up the canyon wall, it would have knocked down the spires and burnished the rock in a much more clean manner. You can actually see it to the right here as well. You can see down below, this has been much more carved out and grinded by the glacier. It's smoother than all of the rock that's a little bit higher up.
Interesting.
This is another image of Cathedral Spires. And I showed this image because one of the unique things being a nature photographer and revisiting locations is how fleeting things are and how quickly things oftentimes change. So this is a composition, a spot that I found many years ago, and I loved it. It was just a unique perspective of Yosemite Valley and Cathedral Spires and the Merced River. I'd never seen any images from any spot like this, so I really wanted to work on it. I tried for many years. But since then, a lot of vegetation has grown up all in this foreground, trees and dogwoods. And so it is no longer even possible to have the same kind of view. And it's one of the things I remind myself when I'm out there photographing or when I'm talking to folks that are out there in the wilderness or they're shooting on their own, is never make the assumption that you're going to go back to a spot and shoot it at another time when conditions might be a little bit better. Because you never know what's going to be there again, or things are changing always so quickly that take advantage of any opportunity you have when you're out there in nature. That's kind of my motto these days. So Yosemite isn't typically known for really amazing fall color, but I think it's quite underrated. There's a lot of
Sorry, Rob, I muted you. Can you hold? Can you hold? Can you unmute yourself? I muted you.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I just muted myself, but now it's going to make me get back and unfortunately do this. I'm going to have to recreate the slideshow. No worries. As long as you weren't muting me on purpose, we're all good. So like I was saying, Yosemite, although it's not really well known for fall color, the black oaks, the dogwoods, the big leaf maples, and a lot of the other shrubs really can put on really fantastic shows of fall color. And this is a day in peaking fall color. And I oftentimes will just grab my gear and wander along the Merced River looking for interesting things to photograph. And the way I approach photography a lot of times, I will try to find one or two compelling elements and then work a composition around that. And, you know, during this little window of time on the Merced River, the big oak on the left here and the other oak in peaking fall color really drew my attention. I just wandered around until I found a nice spot that put those two elements in a nice balance in the frame. And it became really obvious that this was the spot. And hung out there and photographed for an hour or so. And then very fortuitously, this nice little cloud, came into the frame and just kind of completed the composition in a way that, much better than I could have even planned if I was trying to plan such a thing. Another great spot for fall color in Yosemite is the Tuolumne Grove of giant sequoias. There are lots of dogwoods up there, as well as spireas and other shrubs that can put on a fantastic show in the fall. And typically the color in the Tuolumne Grove is a little earlier than what's in Yosemite Valley as it's higher in elevation. So this typically peaks in mid to late October. I'd been waiting for just the right conditions for quite a number of years to come together to really head down the Tuolumne Grove and try to photograph. And those series of conditions were peaking fall color, as well as a cloudy day, because a bright sunny day is just too contrasting, doesn't work for the type of photography that I like to do. And looking at the weather forecast, there was a day coming up, And so I headed to the trail of the Tuolumne Grove. And the forecast for that day also calls for maybe a 70% chance of rain. And just as I'm loading up my gear in the car, it starts raining hard. And so everybody's coming up from down the Tuolumne Grove back out to their cars to get out of there. Well, I'm putting all my heavy gear heading down into the grove to photograph. And I was looking at me like, who's this crazy dude, loading up to head down in there. But there was a specific reason for it. I mean, not just for the cloudy conditions, but the rain and any kind of moisture like that tends to really bring out colors and textures and make images pop. And that's one of the reasons there's just so much intense color in this image, that same spot, cloudy day, without the moisture, literally wouldn't have the same kind of impact. See if I have anything else I wanted to say about this guy. So every once in a while, when I'm wandering around photographing, an amazing gift just falls in my lap. And it doesn't happen very often, but when it does, I'm quite happy to take it. And this is one of those situations where hanging down the Merced River, I was cruising down, and typically when I'm doing slideshows, I have an audience that I can engage with, and I might stop and ask everybody, what's going on with this image, and get their take on what they're looking at. And so I can't really do that in this format. I'm gonna be quiet for a few seconds, let you look at it, and try to figure out what's going on in the image before I talk more about it. So just take a look at it in your head, peruse how this is being captured, and I'll come back to talking about it in a few seconds. So I've never tried that before. I don't know if it's going to work at all, but I'm sure many of you have surmised what's going on here. And this is an eddy. So the Merced River is flowing from left to right, and the flow of the water is coming in this little alcove and swirling around. And all the leaves that has fallen into the Merced River are caught up in this eddy and been flowing in this whirlpool-like fashion. And the way I captured this visually was with a long exposure of 30 seconds. And that means that each of these little lines here in the frame is a single leaf moving through the frame over 30 seconds. And that's why kind of at the center of the vortex, they're smaller lines because they're moving slower than the leaves that are kind of on the outskirts. And these leaves here are barely moving at all. These leaves are pushed up against the little leaf down. And these kinds of scenarios are just super fun to photograph. Visually, they're compelling. They tell stories. It's just really, really a blast. And it wasn't anything I planned. I just happened upon it and spent hours working on an interesting image of this kind of scene.
Incredible.
One of my favorite times to photograph is the collision between seasons, where you get this wonderful visual juxtaposition of conditions. So in this case, we've got the back end of fall, butting up against the first heavy snowstorm of the winter. And it's just that visual appeal is something that's always striking to me that I try to capture if I see it happening at any time. And, other than that kind of visual appeal thing, I really want to, talk about in this image is this amazing tree on the right side of the frame. And this is a black oak. And black oaks are not only wonderful photographic subjects in that they have these beautiful arching branches and stately trunks and beautiful fall color, but ecologically, they're incredibly important as well. They're kind of like nature's one-stop shop. Numerous animals, mammals, and birds nest or den in the cavities of the trees. The trees themselves provide lots of habitat for numerous insect species that they themselves are prey for lots of birds that use the oak trees as habitat to find insect prey. Leaves, deer browse off the leaves. I can kind of go on and on about that ecological impact. Perhaps the most important, or not important, most important, but valuable product of the oak tree is the acorns that we've all heard of. And not only for the numerous species that depend upon the acorn for sustenance, but it was a major staple for many of the Native American tribes in California, including the Awanichi in Yosemite Valley. And it's really well known and documented that they heavily manipulated their landscape for the benefit of the black oaks that they would in turn benefit from in the future. This wonderful relationship ecologically with these species that they depended on. Yeah, I think that's what I'm talking about, black oaks. So moving on to another spectacular tree species. There aren't too many more amazing than the giant sequoias. And they have so many phenomenal qualities. I don't even know where to start talking about them. Outside than their massive scale, they transpire, a mature tree can transpire 700 gallons of water up through the leaves, meaning that they're taking that water from the roots, moving it all the way up through the trunk, and then out to those leaves, which in and of itself is a spectacular, phenomenal feat of engineering, right? And in line with that copious amount of water use, they are incredibly fast growing, right? They can put on 1,000 pounds of wood on their frame in a year, a mature tree can. Phenomenal amount of growth. And that's also unique about these trees because most tree species that grow that fast typically die young, right? They have a kind of a live fast, die young life reproductive strategy. But the reason giant sequoias get to be such massive in size is, in addition to their super fast growing pace, they're very long lived. And some of the reasons that they can live such long lives is they have a lot of tannins in their wood, that prevents rot and decay and insect pests from destroying them. They also happen to be very resistant to bark beetles that no one's quite sure why. But for all those reasons, they tend to be very long lived, and it's how they're able to grow to such massive volumes. One of the last things I really want to mention about the giant sequoias is their association with fire. And I'm sure a lot of you know this, but it's really a remarkable correlation that warrants mentioning. And they're really dependent on fire. So typically a natural fire regime, the fire would come through the low growth, relatively low intensity fire, but every once in a while would hit some bigger fuels and it would blow up in heat. And the increase of heat and smoke would move its way up into the canopy and affect the cones that are up there and allow them to open up and shortly thereafter release the seeds. And then once the seeds are released, they are falling onto this bare, rich mineral soil that's just been prepared by the fire that the seeds need to germinate. And so it's this wonderful association. It's a beautiful relationship that's critical for the existence of the giant sequoias.
Put the book up here.
Fire isn't just associated with giant sequoias, right? I mean, our entire Sierra Nevada ecosystem, all of our forests have evolved with fire. It's a really natural part of the process. This was a fire called, this was the Meadow Fire in 2014. And this is the natural fire regime where there were a series of lightning strikes late summer in the backcountry of Yosemite, igniting all these little fires. And typically what would happen is those fires would ignite and they would burn relatively low intensity and they would burn out the trees around the forest or rains shortly thereafter because they're oftentimes associated with lightning storms would put out the fires. And all of that helps to clean the forest out, helps the reproductive of the conifers, and just a real natural part of the fire process. This is taken near Glacier Point Road. There's not many times when there's the opportunity to photograph Half Dome and fire. And I knew this fire was going on some ways behind that just in researching the fire. So I drove up one evening early in the fire and the full moon was rising up through the smoke and the little stars in the sky. It was really quite amazing to see little patches of fire in the backcountry of Yosemite. And it's really important to think of fire as an agent of of renewal and change, rather than just an agent of death and destruction, like a lot of folks do. Because that's really what fire is. Our habitats have evolved with fire, and so they really need it for their health. And shortly after fire, except in the situations when it is burning such incredibly hot temperatures that essentially sterilizes the soil and takes a long time for things to regrow, there's a huge flush of growth right after a fire that slowly succession brings other species in. But some of the first species to follow right after fire are the lupins that put on phenomenal floral shows. And there are two species of lupin flowering the spring just after the big meadow fire in 2009. Kind of on a interesting, I wouldn't call it a funny side note, more of an interesting side note, the big meadow fire was originally a prescribed burn, that their idea was to burn this meadow right here in Big Meadow, the little community of Foresta that many of you will see on Highway 120 driving into the valley. And the idea was a prescribed fire in the meadow. Well, when they started the fire, it was within the parameters of a prescribed burn. Shortly thereafter, winds picked up, blew across the fire lines, and ended up burning 7,000 acres of the park they weren't anticipating burning. So it wasn't by design, but again, fire is an important part of the landscape, and so it's hard to say that it was necessarily a bad thing. Yosemite is also really well known for its dogwood blooms, the mountain dogwood, and one of the reasons these plants tend to be so showy is the flowers actually come out before the leaves do. And so the flowers aren't obscured by the foliage. It really makes them showy and pop out, and almost like they're dancing on these big branches floating through the forest. And it's a bit confusing, but you might think that the white parts of this flower are petals, but they're not. They're actually bracts. They're part of more of the reproductive part of the flower. And the actual flower itself are tiny clusters of very small flowers in the center of the dogwood that are visited by lots of different insect species that are the pollinators. But dogwoods put on a great show, great photographic subjects. Another interesting thing about dogwoods is one of the reasons they're so successful is that they are able to fully photosynthesize underneath the canopy when they are only getting maybe 50% or less of the sunlight that filters through the canopy. So they're really efficient in their photosynthesis. That's one of the reasons that they're able to be so successful underneath a big canopy. One of the wonderful things about the flowers in Yosemite is they move up in elevation. So early in the spring, say March and April, you'll find flowers down the Merced River Canyon in the lower elevations. But over the next several months, the flowers will move up in elevation as the seasons progress. And these are some alpine paintbrushes that I found at, I think it was near 11,000 feet in August up in the high country of the Sierra. And, you know, at any time of year during that broad window of time, if you're in the right place at the right time, you can very likely find something flowering in the Sierra Nevada, which is quite amazing. And I was really enamored by this little grouping of flowers. It might seem really simple, but for some reason, they really attracted my attention. And I spent an inordinate amount of time trying to photograph these guys and trying different lighting conditions. Never could get just what I wanted. And this is on a backpacking trip in the backcountry. So, you know, I had time to spend with them. And finally, after giving it a bunch of effort, the prime light was when the flowers were slightly backlit. And it creates the golden, the little bit of rim light on the hairs on the outside of the stem that really bring out the details. Those are really minutiae subtleties of photography, but those are the little things that I think really make imagery powerful and work. So moving away from the individual species of plants, meadows in general are ecological wonders. the meadows in Yosemite comprise less than 5% of the overall park space, but they host an incredibly high, disproportionately high number of species, really, really rich. And they're essentially like little islands of biodiversity kind of laid out in the patchwork of the broader ecosystem. And I've seen loads of wildlife in meadows, from bears and owls and deer and butterflies and beetles. And just, it feels like anytime if you spend enough time looking in a meadow, you're going to find some amazing life. It's just so incredibly lush. And in addition to all that rich biodiversity, meadows also are incredibly important in the hydrologic cycle, right? They're like giant sponges. They absorb water and hold it and slowly allow that water to filter, purifying it and percolate down into the underground aquifers that we depend upon kind of in years of drought, kind of slowing that spread and capturing the water. And this was a meadow up in the Crane Flat area of Yosemite. So this is a show for the Audubon Society, and I figured I better put some images of birds in there as a result. My background as a biologist, I did a lot of work with a variety of different species of birds, some endangered species of Southern California. I spent a lot of time finding birds' nests, watching behavior, setting up blinds. So it's always been a big part of both my biologic background and also something I've always really enjoyed photographically, finding birds. And here's a mountain bluebird in all its bright, striking glory. So one of the things that gets easily overlooked in Yosemite, with all of the phenomenal waterfalls and peaks and granite features and icons, is how incredibly diverse the bird species are. Somewhere up near 270 species have been observed in Yosemite. And that's something like near a quarter of all of the bird species in the lower 48 states. So a really high percentage of bird species have been seen in Yosemite. And one of the main reasons for this kind of disparity is the incredible topographic relief that encompasses Yosemite, spanning over 11,000 feet, from the canyon bottoms and the chaparral habitats on the western side of the park to the 14,000 foot peaks on the eastern side of the park. That huge range of topography and all of the ecosystems and habitats that it encompasses allow for really a wide range of bird species that either nest, visit, migrate through, or a lot of them are also year-round residents. Here's a western wood pewee. Here's a northern flicker. I forgot, I had another couple things I wanted to mention about these guys. So it might seem, the next image, I'm a little partial to, among all the birds that I love, woodpeckers and generally cavity nesting birds. I just always found it amazing. In addition to birds that build these intricate nests, ones that are drilling holes into super dense wood and creating habitats and homes for themselves. So here's a northern flicker and following a red-breasted sapsucker with a bunch of insects that it's bringing to its young inside the cavity. One of the more interesting birds that's out there, certainly from a behavioral standpoint, are the sooty grouse. I'm sure some of you have had interesting encounters with these birds out there because it's almost comical. They rely so much on camouflage and blending in that they, to some degree, have lost a lot of their fear. So you can literally walk right up to these birds. Like if you see them from a distance and you're very casual, quiet, careful in your approach, they'll just hunker down and allow you to kind of approach pretty closely and check them out close up. And they have some of the most beautiful and intricate patterns in their, I hit the button, sorry about that. In their foliage, or in their plumage, that is just striking colors and textures and patterns. It's always amazing to see these guys when you're out there wandering about. And they're on a lot of the common trails up around Glacier Point, and the May Lake area is a really common place to have interesting observations of them. So there are a handful of species in Yosemite, that bird species, that are incredibly special for any number of reasons. And the great gray owl is certainly one of those. There's only 200 to 300 nesting pairs in all of California. And Yosemite and the surrounding area is really the main focal point for that population. So super important ecologically. And they have so many outrageous adaptations that I could do a whole slideshow on great gray owls, but I'll have to just hold down to a few of them. They're huge birds, right? They have a wingspan that can be 5 to 5.5 feet and in a really large body size, but nonetheless, they could fly right by you and it would be absolutely silent. They have these little mufflers on the back of their wings to inhibit any sound as the wind passes over their wings, and they're absolutely silent. It doesn't seem even possible to have such a big bird fly so close and not hear a sound. I've had that happen to me numerous times, which is crazy when you think about all the little birds that fly by, or hummingbird, or anything else, when you can easily hear the beat of their wings. It doesn't happen with the great gray owls. In addition to that, they hunt mostly by sound. They have these facial discs that transfer the sound to their ears. And because their ears are asymmetrical, one ear opening is higher than the other, that allows them to key in on their prey on a horizontal plane, and on a vertical plane up and down, while the sound coming time-wise, the sound coming to one ear quicker than the other allows them to key in spatially on a horizontal plane. So those two different ways of horizontal and vertical combining together, sound coming to the ears, is how they key into most of their prey species. Really phenomenal birds. There's not a lot of them in Yosemite. They're shy and elusive. So in all my time there, I've only seen a handful, but certainly one of the one of the highlights of anything I've seen out there in the park. Bald eagles occur in Yosemite as well, in a couple of main areas. Oftentimes you'll see them in the higher elevation lakes, and also in the Merced River Canyon. And this is kind of lucky opportunity where I was literally just driving on the Merced River Canyon one day, and it's pretty unmistakable when a bald eagle flies by because of their size and striking pattern. And I saw this eagle dive from a tree down towards the river, and I parked my car, instantly jumped out, grabbed my gear, and I just tried to gauge about where the trajectory might take the bird. And so I was poking around through the shrubs, came over a small berm, and then boom, right on the other side of the river, there was this eagle hanging out in this beautiful oak tree with a massive trout in its talons. And I couldn't have asked for any kind of better overall composition. I personally am really drawn to wildlife images that put the animal in the context of their habitat. So it's not just a portrait of an animal, but adds a little bit of dimensionality to the image and helps to learn about their own biology and ecology. And so for a half hour, I watched this eagle as it slowly devoured this fish, eating it tail fin and all. And I'm really not quite sure on your screens if you can see really the size of the fish here, but it's a big fish for the Merced River. It was quite impressive. So one of the things that was really enjoyable, one of the most enjoyable aspects of the book project I did was all the background research, learning about tidbits of information to include in the text. I learned a lot of really wonderful stuff, but I don't know if I learned anything more compelling than what I learned about butterflies. You might see that when they're flying about, it's just this random haphazard flight, but it's very directional. They're actually flying with purpose to something that they want. And the way that they're able to determine what they want to fly towards is an amazing a series of senses that they have. They have these huge compound eyes that can see movement, as well as color, including the UV spectrum that's well out of our ability to see. They have smell receptors scattered about their entire bodies. They also have taste organs that are scattered about, including a concentration of the taste receptors on their feet and legs, meaning that when a butterfly lands on a plant, it can actually taste the plant. And I just think that is so darn cool. It's one of the things I learned about in the book that I feel like I have to pass along to everybody I talk to. And this species of butterfly is called a greenish blue, a bit of a mundane a name for it, but there's a lot of species that are very closely related and difficult to tell apart. And I had to get a professional expert to help identify this species from the other blues that are out there. Quite possibly the cutest critter in all of Yosemite is the American pika. But don't let these guys' cuteness surprise you. They occupy some of the harshest and most intense habitats of any animals out there. While a lot of animals will either migrate or move down in elevation or hibernate during the winter, pikas are one of the very few continental US mammals that occupy and are active year-round in alpine environments. And they do that underneath the snow, where they dig tunnels, and they've got different burrows, and then during the fall or during the season, they've collected lots of vegetation that they bring down into these into their hay piles that they eat all winter long, and they collect quite a diversity of plant species in these piles. And it's really interesting that some of the plant species that they collect actually inhibit the growth of bacteria on their hay piles. They actually preserve the piles of vegetative material for them to eat later in the season. Some of the plants they bring in as well have toxins in the leaves. And for those plants, they just wait till later in the season and all those toxins have dissipated out before they eat them. Really amazing survival strategies for living in these super harsh winters at high elevations. Also very high on the cute scale are the yellow-bellied marmots. And these are the largest of the squirrel family. They are about the size of a robust house cat, to give you some idea of their general size if you haven't seen them yourselves. And this is another one of those somewhat fortuitous encounters as an ecologist, where I was out there in the area actually scouting about, looking for some landscape opportunities for the future. And I saw these two marmots engaging, having a bit of interactions, and I sat and watched them for a few minutes and saw that there was a considerable amount of interaction between them. So I went back, grabbed my camera gear, and found an inconspicuous little spot in their territory to sit down. I just got there, hung out, hunkered down, and the next period of time, they got used to my presence and ended up scurrying all about me, chasing each other, wrestling, hugging, shoving each other over. It was some of the most tender and endearing and beautiful interaction between two critters that I'd ever seen. And this image was just kind of the epitome of their interactions, kind of sweet, tender embrace. And I guess I won't ever know for sure whether these two were courting. It certainly seemed that way. as an ecologist, but I wouldn't know for sure. I can say for sure that returning to the territory several months later, these little guys were around. And just generally speaking, the yellow-bellied marmots are some of the most charismatic, funny, and portray the most interesting behaviors and mannerisms that are incredibly photogenic. You know, I've looked at this image many times over the years, and still to this day, it makes me giggle looking at these guys there. They just, the way they hold themselves and carry themselves is just absolutely hilarious. Really fun animals to watch and hang out with, if not photograph. So although bobcats are really generally very shy and elusive, Yosemite Valley is probably one of the best spots to have encounters with them. Not only are quite a few of them there present year round, but they become so used to people that they just don't have a lot of that fear. And it allows the ability to watch them go about their normal behaviors when you may not otherwise be able to. And I saw this bobcat one day when I was out and about, and literally over several hours was able to follow it and hang out with it, watch it hunt, move through the different meadows, looking for prey. You know, it, in some respects, maybe a little bit unfortunately, is so used to human presence that it actually got too close to me. So I would literally have to keep backing up because I wanted to keep a considerable distance from animals I'm working with, so I do not impact their behavior at all. And so I continually had to keep backing away to use a long enough lens to be able to photograph them in the way I really wanted to. And bobcats are not only strikingly beautiful, but really phenomenal predators, really kind of very generalist predators. They can hunt birds, rodents, squirrels, rabbits, even deer occasionally. And they employ a variety of different techniques in these different hunting methods, depending what the prey is. So for some of the smaller rodents and critters like that, they typically use a wait and pounce method. But for the bigger prey, they will stalk them quietly and then chase them to take them down in the end. And they've got a variety of ways to deal with kind of a diverse array of prey that they take. So possibly moving slightly down the cuteness scale for some of you are the Yosemite Toads. But their story, their biological story, is no less compelling than any animal out there. These guys are really phenomenal. They live at these in high elevation wetlands and meadows. And during very narrow windows of time during the spring, the males come out into these very shallow pools, maybe only a couple of inches deep on the edges of these wetlands, where they vocalize and vigorously defend very small patches of these pools. And with this vocalization, they will bring out the females, and the females will come out of the forest. This might be the first time in maybe 3 years that they've come out of the forest in response to the vocalizations of the males, and come out into these little pools in search of their perfect male with just the right voice, right? Or just the right little patch of pond that he's defending. And then they'll meet up. The female will lay upwards of 1,500 eggs. That are fertilized by the male. These eggs are toxic from day one. Toxicity stays from the eggs to the tadpoles into the adults, keeping them as common prey for other predators. And the crazy thing is these eggs hatch within a matter of days into tadpoles. And those tadpoles metamorphose into the young frogs in only 6 weeks. So their time frame of reproduction is incredibly fast to handle the really small window of time when there's just enough water out there. It's a really tightly scaled, amazing association of the toads and their habitat. Another interesting point about the Yosemite toads is they're sexually dimorphic. A lot of you may know what that term is. I mean that the males and the females look differently, right? But whereas a lot of the bird species that are sexually dimorphic the males are the showier ones, right? The brighter colors and the more pronounced. Where in the toad, it's the female that's the showier of the species. It's quite unique. There are not many species sexually dimorphic where the female is actually showier than the males are. So when I mentioned earlier that the males vigorously defend these little areas, I was not exaggerating at all. These are two males right here, and they are literally wrestling. There's one male, they'll jump on the back of the other, get him in like a headlock, and then try to shove the other toad's head below the water, proving its dominance. And I've had a lot of really amazing wildlife encounters, big megafauna and super charismatic creatures. But I tell you, laying in the mud, watching these two guys battle was one of the coolest and most amazing wildlife encounters I have ever had. It was absolutely awesome. The loser was the guy on the bottom, and shortly after he was dominated by this guy on the top, he went off, tried to defend another territory, and there's this constant battle among the different toads. Really, really super cool to be a part of and witness, but it's just got to be very lucky and timely. I guess I should say I had the help of a Yosemite aquatic biologist to help me time the visit to see these guys. Sorry about that. I hit that button one more time. So for any of you who are interested in finding Yosemite toads, there are a few spots up by the Gaylor Lakes area where you can find them. And some of the other spots are pretty hard and remote in the backcountry of Yosemite. But their populations, although they had declined quite a bit, are again spreading and improving. So a lot of spots they weren't previously are starting to be found again. So in addition to the big grand landscapes and flora and fauna, I also really enjoy shooting what I consider the intimate landscapes. That are tightly framed. And this is a Jeffrey pine. And it's what's called a Krumholtz form. And a lot of trees can take this form. And what the Krumholtz form refers to is where trees grow in really exposed, heavy snow-loaded areas with high winds. They tend to take on these extremely gnarled, twisted formations that belie how old they are. The trees tend to be a lot older than they might seem. But it's this contorted tree trunk that just shows resiliency and determination that make them pretty prime photographic subjects. Here's an abstract of just a bunch of grasses popping up through a very shallow pond. Abstracts like this can be very challenging photographically. It's hard to create some sense of order in and amongst all the chaos. One of the ways I try to do that sometimes is by finding semblance of order. And so on the left side of the frame, you can see all of the grasses kind of moving into the right, creating a bit of an overall framework for the composition. But just graphically, the colors and the lines are what drew me to the scene. Reflections provide innumerable possibilities for abstracts in lots of different opportunities and places. In this particular situation, a peak was being directly illuminated by the sun, and it was being reflected down into the lake that was in the shade. And those combination of elements of the brightly reflected peak showing the yellowish colors in combination with the reflection of the sky and the blue and the slight greens of the trees and the dark patches of the forest and shade, combined with a little bit of wind, creating the ripple in the water, can just create the most phenomenal abstract patterns that you oftentimes don't really know until you try to photograph them and start taking images and seeing what the results are like to kind of expand that creativity mode. Here's a bit of a broader scene, but still something I would consider an intimate landscape because there's no big, grand horizon, big peaks and things like that. This is a little pond right off of Highway 120 as one's driving up into the high country of Yosemite. And these little simple scenes I'm always drawn to, not just because there's so much wildlife oftentimes present in these little ponds, but also they're again so important from our ecological perspective and how we deal with water and how water flows through our landscape and moves through the ecosystem and is in a constant cycle of change. Frozen water, ice, also provides great abstract and intimate possibilities photographically. This was taken during the crazy winter of 2011, 2012, when it didn't snow up in the high country of Yosemite until mid-January. And as a result, Tioga Pass was open and you could drive up in there and there was no snow around, but everything was frozen, creating a very surreal landscape. And there were ice patterns all over the place that were quite compelling and interesting graphically. And to this day, I've had no one be able to explain to me how ice forms in this crazy fractal kind of pattern. So if any of y'all know this or have clues on it, please, I'll be happy to hear in our Q&A afterwards, or send me a note about it. So although this is a really small and relatively simple image, it's actually one of my absolute favorites, in part because it's a pretty unique phenomenon called hoarfrost. And hoarfrost only exists under pretty a unique set of conditions. And those conditions are a combination of a lot of humidity in the air combined with super cold temperatures. And the combination of those events, what happens is the water vapor actually settles on some hard surface, and then it bypasses the water factor of dew and goes straight to ice. So it goes straight from a vapor to a solid, bypassing the liquid phase of dew. And in that process, creates the most striking, delicate, intricate, beautiful ice crystals I've ever seen. And, I don't know if this image does justice just to how beautiful they are. And to give you a sense of scale, all the hoarfrost is on a little sedge. So the little plant material, the sedge, is only maybe 3 or 4 inches tall, just to give you an idea of the overall scale of this. But the delicate and the intricate nature of the crystals up here is just truly mind-bending. All right, so let's get back into some of the bigger grand landscapes. So much of Yosemite is known as Yosemite Valley, and Yosemite Valley is really only a tiny fraction of the entirety of the park, but takes so much of the credit. And so I like to give a lot of attention to what I call the high country, the areas out of the valleys and such. And a great place to gain that overall general perspective of the high country is near Glacier Point, where this was taken, where you can see down into Tanaya. I got to work on my touchiness with my mouse here. You can see down into Tanaya Canyon here, and Little Yosemite Valley to the right of Half Dome, Vernal and Nevada Falls, as well as up into the higher elevations of the park. That's somewhat obscured by the clouds in this image, and obviously Half Dome right there in the forefront. And really a great place for a general perspective on the park. Tanaya Lake is the most easily accessible high elevation lake in the park, because Tioga Pass Road drives right along the edge of it. And it's interesting because Tanaya Lake is actually only about 100 feet deep, so it's relatively shallow. And the reason it was formed, how it was formed, was that during several glaciation periods, but the most recent one, the Tuolumne ice sheet slid over this area and had a thickness of 2,000 feet. And the pressure and weight of that ice sheet flowing over this landscape carved out the depression that is now Tanaya Lake. And then as that glacier retreated, the rains and the melting water ended up filling in the lake and created what we see now. Other really obvious glacial remnants out there are these big boulders that are called glacial erratics that were carried down from higher elevation in the glaciers, almost like a giant conveyor belt. And when the glaciers melt and backed off, dropped those big boulders just wherever they were. And it's kind of almost like a giant scattering about giant rocks. Kind of a cool story behind the boulders. A little more difficult spot to get to, but not what I would really consider the backcountry of Yosemite, is Sentinel Dome. And I'd argue that Sentinel Dome is one of the single most epic spots anywhere in the park, because you gain a phenomenal 360-degree panorama view in all directions. So you can see, as we're looking right here, down the Tanaya Canyon and up into the high country of Yosemite, including, you can see the Cathedral Range up there and Mount Conness. But then off of the frame to the left, you look down into Yosemite Valley, and to the west, all the way out to the Coast Ranges, and over to the right, you can't see in this frame, would be the Clark Range. And so you get a really entire panoramic view from one spot, really giving a great overall impression for how big and the diversity of the landscapes in the park. So really, my happy place is in the backcountry of Yosemite. I really love having a pack on my back, carrying all the gear that I need to live for as long as I want, including my camera gear, and just going out and exploring. The freedom, the self-sufficiency, the freedom, the flexibility to be wherever I want, go wherever I want, spend the time there if I want to photograph or move on, is all the above rewarding, powerful, and quite productive as well. I find that those are oftentimes my most productive photographic times when I'm out just in and amongst the wilderness with my gear for days at a time. This image is looking down on Lower Young Lake with Mount Conness in the backdrop and White Mountain. A relatively easy, all things considered, for the Sierra Nevada 6.5 mile hike into this area. The small body of water in the foreground here is formed the same way that this larger body of water was formed that I just talked about a few minutes ago, because this bigger body of water is Tanaya Lake that we were just looking at. But this little one, the smaller brother or sister, if you will, essentially formed the same way as a glacier slid over and carved up a shallow depression. It's called a tarn. It's essentially just a small glacier made lake in granite. And this kind of spot is my ultimate destination spot photographically in the backcountry, because I found it while I was just out and about exploring. And it just, to me, puts all the pieces together of an amazing landscape photograph that an area in general I'd never seen before photographed. Tells a story, lots of things to look at, including, subtle half dome here in the backdrop. And so I revisited this spot numerous times over the years, just trying to capture, conditions that would warrant a more compelling kind of photograph. So we just talked about the tarn, a little body of water formed by glacier. This is another small body of water formed through glaciation called a kettle. And these are formed at the very tail end of the glaciation process, when there's just big blocks of ice out there in the landscape that are sitting on a sill or a very soft material. Those blocks of ice, just with their weight, end up digging out a bit of a depression. And then every spring and in the summer, those little depressions fill with water. And create great reflections, photographic opportunities, as well as a wonderful geologic classroom out there. And there's a lot of these little kettles that are dotted about right up near Tioga Pass. So the area, as you're heading up into Tioga Pass, out to the right is called Dana Meadows. And you'll see lots of little, mostly round bodies of water out there. There are these small kettles that were formed from that process I was just mentioning. This is one of the more highly recognizable features in the Yosemite backcountry. It's Cathedral Peak. And Another interesting glaciation process, this is called a nunatack. And even during the peak glaciation periods, there were certain bodies of rock that stood up above the sheet of ice. So essentially, Cathedral Peak and several other peaks out there were essentially islands of rock in and amongst a sea of ice. And then as the glaciers slid by, they carved the edges of those peaks such that they have the kind of the razor thin ridges and spires on them that was caused as a result of them being what's called a nunatack. Some of my favorite views in the backcountry of Yosemite are looking down into Yosemite Valley, where you can put together all of the really phenomenal, iconic features all in kind of one frame. And this is kind of a unique perspective from the South Rim, where you can see obviously Bridal Veil Fall here in the foreground, Ribbon Fall over here on the left, El Capitan, Half Dome, Sentinel Dome that we just talked about over here to the right. Really great perspective. And I would say anybody wanting to do a really spectacular trail in the park, the Pohono Trail that grows from Glacier Point to Tunnel View that goes right by this spot is mile for mile one of the most amazing and epic hikes in the park that quite honestly is kind of under the radar. For how amazing it is, it gets very little traffic compared to so many other trails out there. A relatively easy backpack destination spot is May Lake. This is only a couple miles into the backcountry, and we took our son on his first backpacking trip. I can't remember how old he was at the time, but when he was old enough to walk that far, basically, and carry a small pack. Magnificently beautiful area, really easy to access. One of the high Sierra camps is just in the area. You can combine it with a wonderful exploration of Mount Hoffman, which if you were to continue up behind where this picture is taken, there's a trail that goes right to the top of Mount Hoffman, which is about a 14,000 foot peak in the park, and right at the geographic center of the park as well. So from there, really amazing views of all the surrounding territory and land. And I'm going to leave you all with perhaps my favorite image of all the images I've taken in the backcountry of Yosemite. This is just my favorite for a lot of reasons. It's just, for me, kind of the picture perfect composition that I found out of nowhere. I was out exploring some kind of deep backcountry lakes wandered around, stumbled upon this composition and just said, wow, there's not much better than this. And I've been back to the spot now 4 or 5 times working on the different compositions. On this particular trip was really when there was the pretty epic sunset that put all the pieces together. And another thing that really makes this image worthwhile for me is the effort it took to get out here, because on the backpack trip out here, I got caught in one of the gnarliest hailstorms I've ever been in. And so I'm out there, a pretty exposed area, starts raining, hail starts coming down a little bit, and I thought I could keep walking through this, not too bad. And then all of a sudden, huge hail bars started coming down. I got whacked on the head once or twice, and I'm like, this is the real deal. I better take cover. It was a little dicey. And so I hid under a tree for about 45 minutes and just laughing to myself as the just massive hailstorm comes down, just the intensity and power of all of it, and cleared up a little bit. And I made my way up and continued on the hike and found this spot at the end. It was almost felt like I was given a present for everything I had to go through to get there. Very fortuitous. So that's all I have for the slideshow presentation. I'm going to give a quick shout out to the book I published. It's a coffee table photography book, like I was mentioning. A lot of the images I've shown you are from the book. Some of the stories as well, but there's a lot more text in the book. I brought in 13 amazing individuals to write essays about different ecological principles and concepts, as well as general Yosemite concepts that I thought would be interesting for folks to read about in combination with a lot of imagery. We've actually unfortunately sold out of all the hardcovers of it within the first several months, which is both good and bad. But we have lots of soft covers still available. So if anybody is interested, I do highly recommend picking it up from either the Yosemite Conservancy themselves, the publisher who I work with, a wonderful organization that does a lot of great work in the park from conservation, as well as outreach and education. So either get it through them or through your local bookshop or through me if possible. If you got it through me, I'd be happy to write a little note, personalized note in it for you. But it's helpful to get it from entities like that rather than Amazon, because all these other smaller organizations could use the sales a little bit more than Amazon could. Just to give you a quick look at just a quick layout, there's a lot of pages with text and full spread layouts throughout the book. So that's all I got. I'm happy to take any questions. It went slightly longer than I expected, so hopefully y'all are still there. I'm not really sure, but I'm happy to answer any questions anybody has.